This is Katrina speaking. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this October workshop for National Disability Employment Awareness Month, NDEAM. This workshop is titled Interpreted Interactions with Deaf Employees. My name is Katrina Johnson. I'm a staff ASL interpreter here at the University of Michigan, and along with me is Casey Ann Watson. I'll let Casey Ann introduce herself.
Hello, my name is Casey Ann. Hi everyone, thank you so much for attending today's workshop. I'm also another one of the staff ASL interpreters here at the University of Michigan. We hope you're able to glean some helpful information today. This workshop will cover the difference between American Sign Language and English. We'll go through an introduction to the interpreting profession. We'll also discuss communication technologies and strategies that you can use, and how to effectively collaborate with interpreters.
Katrina speaking. We will begin by covering some important terminology that will be used throughout the presentation. Some terms may be a review, and others may be new to you. To begin, deaf, spelled with a capital D, refers to someone who is deaf and accepts a cultural identity belonging to the deaf community. It does not refer to the degree of hearing loss a person has, but saying a deaf person is using identity first language and is usually the preferred terminology in the deaf community. When you see deaf with a lowercase d, that's referring to the degree of hearing loss, which is typically profound. Hard of hearing also refers to a degree of hearing loss and ranges from mild to severe. Hearing impaired is on this slide because even though it's an older term, there are some people who still prefer that term. However, many people find it offensive. Nowadays, people typically prefer deaf or hard of hearing. Along this vein is a person with hearing loss. This is what's called person first language in the disability community, and this is sometimes the preferred terminology, and you may even hear us use it in this presentation. DeafBlind with a capital D and a capital B refers to a person who is a member of the deafblind community, again, a cultural identity. And then lowercase deafblind, both D and B, not capitalized, is referring to the degree of hearing and vision loss. A few additional vocabulary words is an interpreter, being a person who facilitates communication between more than one language, spoken or signed. They convert information from one language into another language, usually in real time, and that's the big difference here between an interpreter and a translator. A translator is a person who works with written text from one language and converts it into another language, usually done not in real time, meaning there's an opportunity for them to prepare, edit, and refine their work for a final production. And last, American Sign Language, you may hear us say ASL, is a non-spoken language used by many deaf and hard of hearing people, primarily used in America. Now, who are we talking about? A 2021 survey found that 11 million people in the United States considered themselves deaf or had serious hearing issues. 11 million sounds like a lot of people, and it is. But when you broaden that search to include individuals with just hearing loss in general, not necessarily serious hearing issues, the number jumps to 48 million people, and that is a lot of people. This number can vary depending on several factors. Some of these potential factors could include the rubella bulge of the 1960s that caused many thousands of babies to be born deaf in just a few short years. Also, the baby boomer population, as they're getting older, many are experiencing hearing loss. And lastly, the effects of war. Soldiers may return home with hearing loss, and there was a large increase in veterans with hearing loss after the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan. All of these factors can have an impact on the size of the community. It's best to keep in mind that everyone is different. Emily Ladau, a disability rights activist and author, says, "If you've met one disabled person, then you've met one disabled person." That one person doesn't represent the whole disabled community, and this is true for the deaf community as well. If you're not sure how someone prefers to communicate, the best thing that you can do is just ask. Our presentation today will focus on American Sign Language and working with an interpreter, but we'll also touch on several other approaches when communicating with deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing people, so you'll get an idea of the variety that we're referring to when it comes to those potential preferences. Providing an understanding of what American Sign Language is will help build some foundational knowledge. So, first and foremost, American Sign Language is much more than a way to represent English with our hands. It's not just English in signed form. ASL is a distinct and unique language with its own culture and history, and it developed independently of English. ASL is also not an international language. It's even different from British Sign Language. If you're interested in the development and history of ASL, check out the presentation on this topic on the ECRT department's YouTube page. To continue, American Sign Language has its own syntax or set of rules and grammar, which is quite different from English and even from other signed languages. For example, where you place a sign, how you move your hands, and your facial expressions all play important roles in communicating meaning. The image on the right shows the 5 key parameters or components of ASL. Those are hand shape, hand or palm orientation, location, movement, and non-manual markers showing facial expressions, for example. Each of these parameters changes the meaning of what's being signed, just like how a change in word order or tone of voice can change the meaning of a spoken sentence. So it's important to remember that ASL stands on its own as a complete manual language, not simply a visual version of English. I'm going to show you 5 different signs so you can get a feel for how important these ASL parameters are and how subtle changes in language production can make a big difference. So I'll show you a few signs for different words and you can practice signing them as well. But while you watch, think about what stays the same. So our first term is paper. Paper. Next, clean. Clean. Nice. Nice. Cook. Cook. And last is school. School. I'll give you a moment to think about which parameter you think maybe stays the same. You may have noticed it was the hand shape, those flat palms that stayed the same for each sign. And some of those signs practically seemed the same, but those ASL parameters guide the production and meaning of what's being signed, so the subtle changes make a big difference. Let's talk about the differences between signing and speaking, especially when it comes to communication and message delivery. First, it's important to recognize that spoken and sign language communicates much more than just words. Vocal intonation, emotion, age, and even gender come through when we speak. In contrast, written English often misses these nuances, leading to potential misunderstandings. That's why written English is not a perfect substitute for ASL. Utilizing an ASL interpreter ensures clear communication and understanding, because interpreters can convey those important language nuances like emotion, emphasis, and tone that would otherwise be lost in written communication. It's important to keep in mind that someone who's fluent in ASL or a native ASL user may not necessarily be fluent in English. ASL, being a true language of its own, is different from English, so fluency in one does not automatically mean fluency in the other. As a reminder, the interpreter is present for the benefit of both parties. Because the hearing individual may not know ASL and the deaf individual may not use English, interpreters help bridge the gap to facilitate effective communication for everyone involved. Finally, I want to emphasize that when communicating with the deaf, deafblind, or hard of hearing communities, they are truly the experts on what communication strategies work best for them. Each person has their own life experiences and preferences, so if you're ever unsure or have a question, just ask.
This is Casey Ann speaking. So now that we have some general vocabulary in our minds and we know that ASL is not the same as English, let's talk about interpreting. So formal education for interpreters is fairly recent, even though the presence of interpreters have been around since ancient Egypt. Our governing board, RID, which was formed in 1964. So again, it's not that long ago. The more formal role of the sign language interpreter has changed over the years. Before interpreter training programs emerged, interpreters were seen as helpers, and most of them were helping family members or deaf friends as well. But the ITPs, again, helped establish the interpreter as a true profession. These training programs come in all different shapes and sizes. We have 2-year and 4-year degrees, masters, and even PhDs now. In order to be able to take the certification test, you're required to have a bachelor's degree. If you have deaf parents or are a CODA, which means child of deaf adult, and you have deaf parents, that means you learned sign language at a young age and are at a near native signer. There are other routes you can take to getting your certification test as well. So our governing board, Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, which we call RID, they administer tests and track our continuing education units. The main type of certification available now for hearing interpreters is called National Interpreter Certification, or NIC. There are previously offered certifications that are still accepted, but no longer offered, like you cannot take the test. One example is the CICT, or Certificate of Interpreting or Transliteration. We also wanted to discuss certified deaf interpreters as well, or CDIs. Certified deaf interpreters have specialized training and or experience in the use of gesture, mime, props, drawings, and other tools that enhance communication. These CDIs possess native fluency in American Sign Language and are recommended for a broad range of assignments where an interpreter who is deaf would be beneficial. If a deaf person uses another foreign sign language or is an atypical signer, has cognitive disabilities, or if the stakes are higher, this ensures clarity to a wider deaf audience. This could also include legal or mental health settings, press briefings, or again, other high-stakes settings where you would use a certified deaf interpreter. Certified deaf interpreters work in tandem with the hearing interpreter, so it's kind of like a three-way interpretation. So back to the testing, there's another option called the BEI, or the Board of Evaluation of Interpreters, which is another certification that the state of Michigan accepts. There's also an educational specialty called the EIPA, the Educational Interpreter Performance Assessment, which an interpreter can get for interpreting K-12 school settings. In the state of Michigan, interpreters are housed within the Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs, which most people know as LARA. Once you have your certification and you're ready to work, you're placed on the Michigan Online Interpreter Registry. Interpreters also adhere to the Code of Professional Conduct, which was put in place by our governing board, RID, in conjunction with the National Association of the Deaf, to ensure that interpreters are held to a higher standard. We're also required to maintain our certification by earning CEUs every 4 years. The state of Michigan is unique in that it requires endorsements for specific types of interpreting. The 3 types are medical mental health, legal, and DeafBlind endorsements. In order to obtain these, you must take trainings and workshops related to the topics before actually being able to work in these types of settings. Katrina and I have the DeafBlind and medical mental health endorsements, and Casey has the medical mental health and an additional educational specialty. One thing you may have noticed if you've seen interpreters working out in the world is that there are often 2 of them working together. This is called team interpreting, and it's done to prevent mental fatigue and maintain accuracy in interpretation. After about 15 to 20 minutes of straight interpreting, the actual interpretation is not as accurate as if you had had a mental break. So the general rule is that if an assignment is 2 hours or more, 2 interpreters are needed. There are exceptions to this rule, and determining if a team is needed goes on a case-by-case basis. So now let's talk about DeafBlind accessibility. First, we'll go over some terminology. Tactile interpreting is when a deafblind person is usually using one interpreter who is sitting or standing in front of them. The top photo on the slide shows an interpreter sitting in front of a deafblind person. When the interpreter is signing, the deafblind person will put their hands over the interpreter's hands to feel through touch what the signs are. The deafblind person, in turn, signs normally back to the interpreter. The second photo is a close-up image of someone feeling what the signs are with their hands. Protactile language or interpreting, according to a workshop on protactile language from C.M. Hall, she quotes, "Protactile is an emerging, documented, tactical language and a socio-cultural philosophy shaping deafblind practice, linguistically, interpersonally, and politically." Protactile utilizes the receiver's hands and body as a reference for communication, conveying information and affirming the deafblind individual's autonomy through touch. So this is when a deafblind person usually has two interpreters. This is shown in the bottom photo with a deafblind person sitting in between two interpreters. The interpreter in the front is relaying information from the speaker, while the interpreter in the back is giving environmental and linguistic information of what is happening around them. Non-tactile interpreting is when deaf people with low vision, close vision, or tunnel vision may have different needs or preferences. For example, in the photo on the left, the interpreter is sitting in a specific location on the left side of the deafblind person's body. They may need the interpreter to stand very close, farther away, or maybe have the interpreter wear a specific color shirt, or for their shirt to have a specific sleeve length. In general, interpreters will wear a plain color shirt that's not patterned and that contrasts their skin tone. They'll also use plain backgrounds for virtual settings that are not distracting. Braille is a writing and reading system using raised dots arranged in a cell that you feel with your fingertips. The right photo is an up-close image of a person reading Braille. Now I'll go over some other deafblind technology. The first image shows a Braille display, which has 8 pins that will populate to make words in Braille from the text that is translating from another piece of technology, namely a computer or a phone. Screen readers, this takes information from what is on the screen and translates it into text or reads it aloud. Signaler devices, which is shown in the second photo, are haptic devices that vibrate with notifications to text, emails, or other external information, such as doorbells or if the baby's crying. Braille keyboards, which is shown in the bottom photo, are traditional keyboards with Braille on the keys so that a user can feel which letter is for which key. Large print can also be very beneficial to someone with low vision, so it's important to keep in mind. Co-navigators or support service providers are people who help guide deafblind people through the environment with constant touch and feedback. Service dogs are one option for deafblind people to use to navigate the world. They can lead them to destinations and alert users to different auditory and visual cues. So here we'll go over how to request an interpreter, ASL or tactile, through the Disability Equity Office, or DEO, which the DEO is housed in the Equity, Civil Rights, and Title IX office. DEO interpreters cover the Ann Arbor campus for these two groups, identified users and inclusive events. An identified user is anyone who uses ASL and requests an interpreter. Inclusive events provide access in ASL without a known identified user. Some of the categories are athletic events, consultations, and meetings. We won't go into them now, but if you'd like more information about the ASL program, you can check out our website for all of that information. So if your request falls into one of the categories on the previous slide, you can schedule an interpreter with our office at no cost to your unit. You can also request consults and trainings on how to use interpreters. When sending a request, the more information, the better. If you can include the who, what, when, where, and why, that should pretty much cover all your bases. Other helpful materials the interpreters can use, such as scripts, slide decks, agendas, can be very helpful. Of course, we understand that each event will have different information depending if it's a staff meeting, a large event, or a training, etc. Please submit your requests with as much notice as possible since our schedules can fill up quickly, though that does not mean we may not be available for a last-minute request. So please always send them. You can also request services up to 6 months in advance, so keep that in mind when planning your events. Once we receive a request, we will respond ASAP with our availability and if we're able to cover with ASL services. However, if we're not available and you do have an identified ASL user, then you are required to go through a vendor which we will set up for you. If you need an interpreter for just general event accessibility and we are not available, we will send you a list of vendors that you can schedule at your leisure. Please note, for both of those instances, your unit will be responsible for costs related to the vendor interpreters. If you're an employee and you want to submit a request, you can log in to our system, Accommodate, through your SSO or your unique name and password and request services straight from the system, Accommodate. If you are a community member or not an employee and you do not have a unique name, you can use the ADA initial contact form, but you can only use that form one time. After that, you must email disabilityequity@umich.edu. After you follow all of the prompts for clicking the ASL interpreter option when you go to log in to Accommodate, whether it's the initial contact form or you're just logging in, you click the ASL option and then just follow the prompts accordingly. So now we'll go over some other things you may experience while working with deaf individuals. Pictured on the slides is an example of a video relay call. This is done through a live interpreter. So if a deaf person wants to place a call, they take their device of choice, whether that's phone, iPad, or video phone. The first photo shows a deaf person holding a remote looking at an interpreter on a video screen. They dial the number and a live interpreter will pop up on the screen. In the middle photo, the interpreter is pictured wearing a headset in front of a video screen. After the deaf person connects to the interpreter will then connect to the hearing party, which is pictured in the last photo. From there, the interpreter will interpret the call. This also goes in reverse. If a hearing person needs to call a deaf person, they dial the number like normal on their regular phone, and the call will automatically route through an interpreter on the line, who will then in turn connect to the deaf person and interpret the call. So this is what happens when you place or receive a call to a deaf person through video relay service. If any person wants to use this free service, it could be for a variety of reasons. Maybe the deaf person needs to call off work, the supervisor needs to inform the team of a new meeting, or the deaf employee is calling to make a report. This service is also important for 911 calls as well. So again, you may experience this if you have to call a deaf person or if the deaf person calls you. Please note, this service does have a strict policy that each person must be in a separate location to use this service. So you cannot make a call to someone who is in the same room as you. If the interpreter realizes you're in the same room, they will disconnect the call. There's also an option within video relay service that gives the deaf person the option to use their own voice as well, while also still watching the sign language interpreter. Video relay service is a free federally funded service under the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC, so you do not incur charges for calling or answering a call from a video relay service provider. So that was video relay. Now this is video remote interpreting, which can be done with the person who's in the same room as you. In the photos on the slide, the interpreter is the one on the screen, while everyone else, deaf and hearing parties, are in person. The second photo is another example of a more intimate setting of video remote interpreting. In these instances, the interpreter is always remote. However, this is not a replacement for in-person interpreter. There are many instances where VRI is not appropriate, one of them being deaf-blind interpreting. There are other circumstances where remote interpreting is not feasible, which we will touch on later. Here are some other tools that deaf people may use. One of them is CART, or Communication Access Real-Time Translation, which is live captioning. There are several phone apps that are dictation, so you speak and the words will pop up on the screen that can make communicating with a deaf person easier just from your phone. Auto captions, like on Zoom or the TV or other software, can be helpful options, but you may need to edit them for accuracy. Also important to make sure whatever digital content you create that is accessible to your audience. So keep in mind that English is not the same as ASL, so written communication may not be accessible to all members of the deaf community. Lip reading can also be a viable strategy depending on how much hearing a person has. However, lip reading in general is not a great strategy to rely on. Only about 30% of the words we say can clearly be understood on the lips. Some estimates even put this number as low as 10%. So understanding 1 out of every 10 words, or one in every 10 words someone says to you, is pretty terrible. As an example, there's a famous line on the slide. This is at a 30% success rate. See if you can guess what famous line this is. Give you a second to think about it. It's the national anthem, "Oh Say Can You See?" That's kind of hard to get from what we read on the slide. Only every other word, say, the, early, so, we, last, doesn't really make sense. So lip reading, again, may not be the most effective strategy.
Katrina speaking. Now let's use what we have learned throughout our presentation and walk through some workplace encounters that you may experience and how to effectively collaborate with a variety of people and the options that are available to you in these situations. We have learned that ASL is a manual and visual language using your hands, which relies on eye contact and physical touch to communicate. Lines of sight and adequate lighting are important considerations to ensure access. Also, consider if there are notes being taken or any break in eye contact. There may be pauses in communication due to those lines of sight being broken. When there's an interpreter in the room, please talk directly to the deaf, deafblind, or hard of hearing person like you would talk to anyone else. There's no need to say, "Please tell her," or "Can you ask him?" Speak directly to the employee instead of addressing the interpreter. Speak at your normal pace. There's no need to slow down. And additionally, the interpreter will speak in first person. For example, if a deaf individual signs, "My name is John," and I am interpreting, I would voice, "My name is John." This may take a moment to adjust to, but remember that the interpreters are working to facilitate communication between the parties, and they don't need to be personally involved in the conversation. Lastly, understand that technology has its limitations. We're going to run through 4 scenarios momentarily. And notice that the use of Zoom in the workplace is very common. However, it's not always a good fit for interpreting due to the potential for technical difficulties, potentially individuals not knowing how to use certain video equipment. Maybe the internet is slow, providing a blurry or choppy video, or the audio quality is not clear and it doesn't provide the ability to hear through the device. In all of these instances, an interpreter on video may not be the best fit. Also, depending on the setup or the position of the situation, a video interpreter may not be feasible. In some of these scenarios, I'm going to include the potential opportunities for those virtual or remote interpreting instances. However, remember that virtual may not always be a good option. For the first scenario, imagine you have a deaf or deafblind colleague that you work with on a daily basis. There's no daily interpreter. Take a moment to consider what your options may be for communicating with each other. You may have already worked out some effective methods of communicating with each other, and maybe you need to reevaluate and try other options. If you're ever not sure, just ask. And remember that each person may be different, and these options could likely change as each person understands their work and how to best process the information exchange. So, some options that you have are you may use technology, videos, captions, phones, your notes app, computers, good old fashioned pen and paper to write back and forth. But remember that English may not be their first language. You might maybe use gesture or indicate information by pointing instead. You can use your facial expressions, visual aids, and any demonstrations to support your communication and maintain eye contact. To get someone's attention, you might wave or do what some may call a subtle hand flutter in their line of sight or in their peripheral vision, or gently tap them on the shoulder. For virtual interactions, consider captions, and keep in mind that visual aids and demonstrations are beneficial to many people. However, you should potentially avoid show and tell. And let me clarify by saying you should show, then tell, or vice versa, but not both at the same time. For example, if you're meeting with someone on Zoom and you share your screen to show the steps of where to find where a file is saved, you may need to pause and remember to show and tell as separate times. That way, their eyes can remain focused on either you explaining the folder names or tracking the mouse on the screen, but your eyes can't be in multiple places at once. Overall, be patient and keep in mind that communication is a team effort. Don't give up. Saying things like, oh, never mind, or I'll tell you later, excludes deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing people from conversations and are rarely genuinely followed up on. Finally, I know the screen says options for interactions without an interpreter, but here at the University of Michigan, anyone can request an interpreter. And this request doesn't have to solely come from the deaf individual or a supervisor. So feel free to offer to submit a request to support the communication access. For our second scenario, imagine a one-on-one meeting with a colleague who uses sign language and the interpreter enters the room. This could be two colleagues meeting to work on a project or maybe a one-on-one meeting with a supervisor. Where might the interpreter position themselves in a one-on-one meeting? A, next to the employee using sign language. B, next to you across from the employee. C, in a triangle formation where everyone can see each other. D, potentially A, B, or C. Take a moment to think about that. And the answer is D, potentially A, B, or C. All of these locations may be appropriate depending on the situation. However, typically, the interpreter will set themselves up across from the deaf employee. This establishes those clear lines of sight. The photograph on the right shows three people in a more intimate one-on-one, possibly a medical setting. There are two people sitting facing each other, and the interpreter is standing just behind the shoulder of the hearing individual. Standing behind the speaker may seem unusual, but this allows the deaf individual to put the interpreter and the other person in the same line of sight. This also gives them the ability to make eye contact with both people. The answer in this case is D, all of the above, because the setup may look different with a deaf-blind employee, such as the interpreter sitting next to the deaf-blind individual, or depending on the availability of space in the room, maybe a triangular formation where everyone can see each other and the interpreter would not be behind the speaker. The third workplace encounter you may be familiar with is attending or even hosting a staff meeting. Imagine a recent meeting that you've attended, maybe a large group, everyone sitting around the table, or a hands-on training, maybe even a virtual team meeting. Does the interpreter need any prep materials for this staff meeting? The answer is yes. An interpreter would find any and all prep materials beneficial. This would mean names of attendees, a meeting agenda, any unit acronyms. I know you all have some. And Even sharing the unit website links for general information would help. It's important to recognize that the interpreter may be the only person in the room without all of the context, which could potentially prompt some clarifying questions. For example, did you say endeem? Is that Ndeem, or how is endeem spelled? Based on the understanding that there's contextual and institutional knowledge and language specifics, if you have ongoing or reoccurring meetings, it's best to have consistent or regular interpreters when possible. Lastly, when in a staff meeting, especially during Zoom meetings, everyone benefits if there's just one speaker at a time and if you introduce yourself before speaking. Finally, for our last scenario, imagine you are a member of a committee hosting a work conference that exceeds 2 hours. You receive a request for ASL interpreting services. Will you need more than one interpreter for a conference over 2 hours? The answer is yes. A team of interpreters is needed. Deaf-blind interpreters also work in pairs. If you don't know how many interpreters you need, don't worry. This is typically an initial consideration from an interpreter's end, and the event needs will be clarified. If your conference hosts breakout sessions happening at the same time and in different locations, your event may require several teams of interpreters. Consider placement for in-person interpreters like stage positioning and if anything is blocking the interpreter from the audience's view. Likewise, for virtual accessibility, ensure cameras have a clear line of sight to the interpreter. For a remote interpreter, there is a variety of accessibility features available in Zoom that you may consider. You could incorporate captions through Zoom or use the pop-out window with the ASL interpretation feature. Individuals could pin the interpreter on their screen, or you can set up the spotlight on the interpreter for everyone in Zoom to see as well. Thanks for coming along while we considered some of those common workplace situations, and we'll leave you with a few things to keep in mind as we wrap up. The key takeaways are that ASL is a unique language and it is not the same as English, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach to communication for deaf, deafblind, or hard of hearing employees.
This is Casey Ann speaking. Some other key takeaways is that all parties involved can work together to support effective communication. Remember, it's a team effort. Lastly, interpreters are professionals guided by the Code of Professional Conduct.
Katrina speaking. In closing, we'd like to teach you all to sign Go Blue. For go, it's a fist pump like raw. And then blue is a flat palm with your thumb tucked in, which will twist out for the color blue. So when you put those together, go blue. Thank you all for watching this workshop. Please check out our website for more information and resources. Thank you.